Hey guys, Westpac has come out and released their 2026 housing market forecast, which goes through city by city where they think house prices will be by the end of 2026. I'm going to go through that in this episode, but I wanted to start here. Periods when to make money. You know, there's this chart that was sent to me a long time ago, actually, and I had wanted to make an episode on it, but here it goes. This chart was apparently made by someone called Samuel Bano, who was a farmer in the 1800s, and he wanted to understand how market cycles work. He published a book forecasting business and commodity prices. He identified years of panic, years of good times, and years of hard times. The top row shows that somehow this guy predicted the Great Depression, World War II, and the dot-com bubble and bust, and even somehow the COVID crash. When I look at the middle row, the years in good times against the Australian housing market, it's pretty accurate. You know, like 1980s was a bit of a miss. Also, you could say it's showing from 1999, prices would go down, but actually those were some of the best times to buy in almost any capital city or otherwise in Australia. I mean, Brisbane, buying around that time, you'd have doubled your money by the time the global financial crisis hit. And of course, through that GFC period, Perth and Brisbane kept doing really well. Even Bendigo, places in Victoria, grew despite the global financial crisis. So this chart, I wanted to share it because it's interesting. Overall, it's got good principles that the market does run in cycles, but there's always markets within markets as well. And so what does this chart show us is going to happen right now? We're going into the end of 2025, into 2026. It's actually showing that this period going up to 2026 is a rise period, and then things will fall. But Westpac doesn't actually agree with this at all. And on a whole different episode, I've taken you through the 18.6 year market cycle and why I think property prices are going to go up all the way to 2032. Go check out that episode. I've shared a whole bunch of charts and analysis, but let's get into Westpac's analysis right here. So Westpac is suggesting that Sydney could rise by the end of 2026 by $154,000. Melbourne, it would rise by $103,000. Brisbane by $93,000. Perth by $102,000. Adelaide by $70,000. And Hobart by $30,000. Of course, not all capital cities or regional towns have been shared here, but suffice to say they're pretty bullish on house prices. And how could you not be with rates potentially falling more? And I'm going to go through that in a bit more detail in a second, with the chronic housing shortage still extremely acute, extremely chronic. And because of labor, we have immigration continuing to plow on. And in fact, student immigration has been ramped up in the last few months by the Albanese government. Now you might say, look, bank forecasts are always wrong, PK. You're right, sometimes they are wrong, but often I say that. For example, I say when I think a bank is being too optimistic or pessimistic. And in this case, I think Sydney could be a little bit optimistic here if rates don't fall a few more times by mid-2026. I think Melbourne is pretty accurate, although there is a big warning with Melbourne, and I'm going to share a chart on that very, very soon. Brisbane, I think, is pretty accurate. Perth as well, it's getting the second wind by people, owner-occupiers, and investors realizing that there is no stock coming to market. There is a supply crunch in Perth, and the immigration continues to rise. Adelaide, I think, is pretty accurate. It's had a great 5-6 years, probably time to slow down, although I know I've been saying that for a few years now. And Hobart, I think we could be in for a surprise on the upside. I know some of my clients are buying in 2 or 3 suburbs in Hobart. They're certainly expecting more than $30,000. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if they make $100,000 in the next 12 months. So I think Hobart might positively surprise on the upside. Now, in terms of interest rates, I think it's important to share this chart from RBA, the US Federal Reserve, IMF, and Quid, which shows that RBA's own estimated neutral rate. Neutral rate is where the RBA deems that policy settings aren't going to tighten the economy any further, nor are they going to loosen the economy. In other words, they're not expansionary, they're not pumping money in, nor are they pumping money out of the economy to slow things down if inflation is out of control. They think that's equilibrium. This is the steady state. So they think the RBA does that the blue line at around 2%. That is the neutral rate setting for Australia. Now, what do I think? I think at the moment it's probably a little bit over 2%, would be my read for the neutral setting. I think 2 or under 2% is a little bit expansionary, but this is what they're sharing. Of course, rates are still much higher here in the orange line than that 2% figure, and therefore that implies further rate cuts, which of course are going to help see that Westpac forecast come into fruition. Also, note for those of you who aren't economists that this blue line, this neutral setting line, is dynamic. You know, some people say we're still extremely low. Back in my day, interest rates are up at 17% or whatever the case may be. Yeah, that's true. But as an economy evolves, as an economy gets on more debt, and of course that's how capitalism works, debt multiplies and sees much more money injected in the economy. An economy's ability to withstand higher interest rates become less and less, and therefore you can see the blue line has been trending down. Now it's up for debate whether you think this is true or false, but what the RBA thinks is it is true, and therefore they're likely to bring interest rates down to equilibrium. It's just how soon are they going to do it? That is the question. But one thing's for sure, and I know so many of you think, how can house prices possibly keep rising? You know, like they've risen so many times, there have been so many booms. This is an interesting chart that I found. The number of millionaires keeps rising. Number of dollar millionaires in millions selected countries in year 2000, 2024, and forecast for 2028. So you can see that between 2000 and 2024, the number of millionaires in Australia went from 0.11% to 1.90%. Now, these are small numbers, but the rate of change, the relativity is what's really interesting. In the US, it went from 7.64%. They were much richer than us, even year 2000, and it went up to 23%. So about a 3x change, right? It went up by 3 times. In Australia, that rate of change was from 0.11 to 1.90. That is almost a 20x change, almost a 20 times increase in the number of millionaires. That is phenomenal. We're getting richer at a faster pace since year 2000 than the US. And that is my basis or thesis for which house prices will continue to rise, because it is no longer the average Joe that dictates house prices in Australia. It is the top 20%, and the top 20% are getting fatter and fatter. There's more of them and they're getting richer. Therefore, if enough people can afford house prices, i.e. the top 20%, then house prices grow, leaving behind the bottom 20%, of course, and of course also the middle class, the 50th percentile. Fascinating chart if you really want to understand the dynamics of what's going on in property in Australia. Now, before we end this episode, I want to share this chart on Victoria. I know every buyer's agent, there's about 10,000 of them now, they're all pumping their clients into Victoria. They're not even doing much analysis these days. They're thinking it's going to be like Perth, where everything booms. It will not all boom. I know they're buying in every nook and cranny, every small regional town, every suburb of Melbourne, even out to beyond Melton, past Geelong, or anywhere they can find a property, buyers agents are buying for their clients. My word of warning. Now, I do think that parts of Victoria will boom. In fact, my clients that have bought in the last 18 months, parts of Melbourne, etc., have already seen $100,000, $150,000 gains. But this chart cannot be ignored. How Victoria compares on household disposable income compared to the OECD, the US, the G7, the rest of Australia, and Victoria. So you can see Victoria, in terms of disposable income, it has fallen since COVID. This is real income, real disposable incomes. And you can see this is a not only massive failure of the government, both the Scott Morrison government that was in power around the COVID time, and then obviously the most recent government, because the rest of Australia, including Victoria, is performing much worse than our peer countries, our Western democratic advanced nations. So Australia is going down, but Victoria is going down even further. Of course, people will blame Dan the man for that, and somewhat correctly. But I'm painting the picture that business sentiment, consumer sentiment, business expenditure, capital expenditure, consumer disposable income, it is very weak in Victoria and still falling. So do not expect a statewide boom like we saw in Queensland, and do not expect a statewide boom like we saw in WA. This is a different beast. This is where those who really know property markets, getting it down to the suburb, the street, the property, true due diligence, not just some random new buyer's agent that used to work an IT job 6 months ago. True professionals, i.e. you, because you can learn this with just 3 to 5 hours a week over 1 or 2 months. These are the people that will be making money in Victoria. Great opportunity to buy in Victoria, but not like it was for so many of you who lucked out in the last 4 to 5 years. Australian house prices, in my view, are definitely going to rise in the next 6 months, in the next 12 months and beyond. In fact, the RBA has released a data point recently that said even if house prices crashed by 30%, 9 out of 10 mortgage holders would still have positive equity. 9 out of 10, they'd still have positive equity. In other words, their loan would be less than their house value. That's how much equity people have in their houses right now. Make up your own conclusions, make up your own mind, but if you want to invest in real estate, the best time to do it is right now. And to level up, I'll leave a link below to my Facebook group, Australian Property Mastery with PK, with more than 60,000 members, amazing people, and my podcast, Oz Property Mastery, on Google, Apple, and Spotify. Guys, no one cares about you as much as you. No one cares about your money as much as you. Invest in the most important real estate. That's the 6 inches between your 2 ears. Invest in yourself, back yourself. This is a terrific time to get started.